Hello and welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. My guests tonight are Dr. Marie Miville, who's an assistant professor of counseling psychology at OSU, and Effie Ashley, who's a student in the American Indians into Psychology program at OSU. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for being on Wordpath.
Thank you.
Actually, you're both connected with this AIIP, as we can call it for short. Marie, you were instrumental in setting the program up to begin with. Could you tell us a little bit about it, what the goals of the program are?
Sure. AIIP is a federally funded grant program that actually is funded through Indian Health Services. And it is a program that it's a collaborative effort between several of the graduate programs at Oklahoma State University. We have the counseling psychology program, the clinical psychology program, and the school psychology program. And it's actually set up to deal with a very basic fact related to mental health services for Indian people and the terrible lack of psychologists who are American Indian who are then able to work with their people. So the program is primarily a summer mentorship program, and actually we have Effie here, who's one of our participants this summer. And the goals of the program is to teach folks how to be in a doctoral program in psychology and how at the same time to work in tribal agencies. So we have our participants working at tribal agencies. We have people at the Cherokee Nation, at the Creek Nation, at the Ponca Nation and Iowa Nation. And we also have them at the same time working with faculty members on research projects. So they kind of learn all the different parts about being a psychologist, especially with the idea of returning to communities and working with Indian people.
I think it sounds like just a great idea. And in fact, I went up last weekend and visited your program to look at the offices and interview a couple of the students. As it happened, Effie was one of them. Let's take a look at that tape.
Sure. Okay, here we have the duck pond that sits in front of Willard Hall, the College of Education, and actually there is the College of Education where the counseling and school psychology programs are. And this is actually the door in that building for the students to do their work. We have a couple of computers there and just space for them to do what they're going to be doing with faculty and with the clinics that they'll be at. And these are just some of the shots of the things that we have up on the wall. Here is the North Murray Hall, which is where the Department of Psychology is. And that's actually home to the clinical psychology program. And it may seem kind of far away, but they're actually just one street apart from each other. This is their office there, and this is one of the advertisements we have for our program when we go to different conferences. This is some more of our computers that we have as given to us from the grant. And again, there's some lovely artwork that we have. Here is actually our participants. They were going to a computer seminar on how to access the internet in terms of finding graduate programs in psychology. And here you have just how to do a search. And
I'm Effie Ashley, and I'm from Window Rock, Arizona. I came to this OSU to participate in this Native American into Psychology summer internship program. It's going to really help me when I get back. Will help with my school, and I learn about how to get into graduate schools and everything. And it will really help me to work with my people when I get back.
My name is BJ Boyd. I'm a graduate student in the clinical psychology program at Oklahoma State, and I signed up to be a part of this program because I thought it would help me. I start graduate school in August. I thought it would be a nice preparation for graduate school to look at some research experience and getting some experience in some clinical setting with some of the tribes around Oklahoma. I'm interested in working with Native American people when I finished my PhD, so I thought it'd be nice to have some experience working with them before I even went to graduate school, and hopefully get to know some of the tribes and some of the people around Oklahoma.
If you're interested in more information about the program AIIP, please contact the Department of Psychology at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and the zip code is 74078.
Thank you, Marie. Now, it's time to kind of make the connection here with language. Both of you all are involved in a psychologically oriented program, and I'd just like to say from the start, I have kind of a grab bag of questions here, things I've collected through the years, because I really feel that language loss, or the more positive side of it, language preservation, is very much kind of a psychological question. I know, Marie, you and I have talked about this before in the connection between language and identity. Can you kind of connect that up for us a little bit?
The way psychologists have generally talked about identity is your understanding or how you define yourself. And the way when we talk about identity for minority peoples, Indian people, the importance of relationships or the importance of connection to others is just critical in terms of understanding who you are. And so when we talk about identity and the importance of knowing your language, it's important to have one for the other. It's important to be able to know how to talk to other people, either within your family, within your tribe, but also I think knowing your language, knowing your native language, connects you with your past and connects you with your ancestors. And it gives you that sense of who you are as a person, as a tribal member, as an Indian person.
Okay, now let's come back to you now, Effie. As you said on the tape, you're from New Mexico, actually, and you're a Navajo person, and you speak Navajo yourself, right? Can you personalize this for us a little bit? Why is it important to speak your language of heritage, your traditional language?
I think it's important to keep your native language for your identity, to represent who you are. And it's very important for your children to know and your grandchildren to know, so that way you don't lose it.
Now, some people that don't know very much about Indian languages might think, well, I can understand wanting to keep your culture and you might have certain ceremonies and so forth, but I mean, I feel I know the answer to this somewhat, but could you explain a little bit? If someone just says, well, why can't you just say the same prayer in English or do the ceremony in English or translate the song to English? Why is that not the same?
Because the translation is not the same. For instance, telling a story in Navajo, it's much more, you can see the meaning of the story as being told in Navajo rather than in English. But
so it doesn't all come across so well in translation, right? It's that old thing they say, it loses something in the translation.
Right.
And you don't want to lose that something,
No.
right? And I suppose what Marie said before, too, about the connectedness, connecting to the old.
That's
the
right.
people who came before you, they didn't speak English. You know, if you go back in Navajo history, they spoke Navajo, and I suppose just that alone makes it also worthwhile.
Yes, also the relationship, like she says, that's all very important.
And actually, Effie touched on something as well, as not only from the past, but what you pass on to future generations too.
Right. So it's the connection from the past to the present and carrying that through all the way into the future generations. That's a kind of continuity of identity, right?
Right.
Now we've been talking, maybe Marie, you could tell me a little bit more again. We were talking over dinner tonight that identity comes in so much to this, and you were talking about assimilation versus acculturation, as these are technical psychological terms, I understand. Can you explain the difference between assimilation and acculturation and show the connection there with language?
Okay, I'll try. Assimilation is kind of an old word in the field of psychology, and back in the early part of the century, psychologists wanted to try and explain how is it that people, especially minority people, Indian people, people who migrated to this country, how is it that they come here and live and quote-unquote adjust and make sense of the world around them. And so assimilation is a word that was used to look at a kind of a one-way adaptation. And what I mean by that is it was looked at as only what is it of, say, white culture or mainstream culture that Indian peoples were learning, or immigrated people were learning. And in the last 10, 20, 30 years, there's been newer models that focus on acculturation, or the fact that people don't just learn one culture, they learn more than one. They know their own, their native culture, and then they learn to live in the white world. And actually one of the people that is an advisory board member of our program, Dr. Sandra Choney, and her associates of the Creek Nation came up with this model for acculturation for Indian people that talks about acculturation having many faces. And that an American Indian person can be very traditional, that is maybe, as with Effie for example, knowing much about the Navajo way, or a person can be bicultural, knowing much about Navajo or traditional and mainstream white American ways, or a person can be marginal, maybe not feel comfortable with either of those. And the point about acculturation, or the newer models, is that no one way is best or no one way is better than another. And I think that's coming from the point of response to these older models that said, yes, there's only one way, and say, no, there are many paths to adjusting and living in this multicultural or bicultural world that Indian people live in.
So if a person is becoming assimilated, they're basically trading off the old culture for the new, you might say.
Yes.
And there's a definite loss there, but you can be acculturated in such a way that you're comfortable in both cultures and you don't lose what either one has to offer.
That's right. And in
I know you just said that you don't want to be judgmental and say there's only one way, but that certainly sounds ideal to me. Is that not the most valuable to people?
I'm not sure I would say valuable, and maybe I'm just being a psychologist with that one, but I think that, when you're a bicultural person, that might give you more options, or maybe experience less of what's called acculturative stress, or when you are trying to adjust to living more than one culture, then if you feel comfortable in two cultures, then it's less stressful for you. And so that's, if you want to put a value on it, that might be one way that if you have more options of how to adjust, know how to adjust.
Effie, where would you put yourself on that scale that she was just describing? Are you a bicultural person or one of the other categories, do you think?
I'm more bicultural, I guess you would say, since I'm going to school and learning about the Western world.
So you're comfortable in both worlds, and
that's right.
Must be very useful to you in your life. I assume it will be useful to you in your later career too.
Yes, it will be.
Because you'll be able to speak, to counsel people who are more traditional and people who are more mainstream culture oriented as well.
Yes, I would be comfortable on both sides equally.
Now I wanted to ask you a little bit too from your personal experience about this language and identity thing, or language and ethnicity. We were talking over dinner that in this state, in Oklahoma, a lot of people consider Cherokee to be the language that's safe. Kids are still learning Cherokee. We don't have to worry about Cherokee. And that's not quite true, because fewer and fewer children are growing up with it, and I think all the languages in Oklahoma are somewhat threatened. And I used to hear the same thing about Navajo on the national scale. Well, most Indian languages are in trouble, but Navajo's fine. They've got, I don't know, I heard at one point 100,000 speakers or something. It sounds like no problem, But you were explaining to me that, first of all, not all young people are interested in learning Navajo, and they're more focused on English language. How does this all, how do you view all this in terms of their identity as Navajo people? Do you feel like the ones that are learning Navajo are more Navajo identified? Does it work out that way?
I believe so. I believe that they practice their own tradition and language. They're Navajo. But if they don't want to learn, there are some students or young people that don't want to learn at all. They're not motivated to learn their native language, and they say, "What's for?" But that's a bad mistake.
So, do you have children yourself, Effie?
I have 6 children.
Did you raise your children all speaking Navajo?
No, they were born and raised in Utah, but they don't speak Navajo or understand it. So I made a mistake of not teaching them Navajo at the time. But when you're young, you don't know anything.
Well, and I know people have a lot of
As a
reasons for
parent.
wanting their children to excel in English, and I don't blame anyone for the choices that they make, really. I think I sure like to see children speaking Indian languages, though, whenever possible. And actually, the Navajo Nation has led the way, I think, in bilingual education in Indian languages. I read several years ago about a bilingual program at Rocky Point, I think. So I know that a lot has been done that is really good for Navajo children.
And I think it's a real dilemma for parents and then for the kids too, because, you know, as you were saying, it's the dilemma of wanting to pass on, you know, traditional language, but wanting to the best for their kids. If how are they going? What kind of world are they going to live in? Where are they going to live? Are they going to live in a place that other people speak this language? Are they going to feel, the kids, are they going to feel like the different ones at school because maybe other people around them don't speak that language? And I think it's a real dilemma for parents, and I see different school systems dealing with it very differently. And some places have real leaders, parents, Indian parents who encourage this kind of language preservation in the schools, and others where you may not see such a presence of people, and so the kids there may not have quite the programming. So it's a real dilemma.
We're lucky in Oklahoma in that we have this House Bill 1017, which encourages the teaching of Indian languages in the school, but I was explaining to Effie before, it's not always that simple, because in so many schools you have a very diverse population of students, and it's become sort of difficult and politically dangerous to figure out how to choose just one language to teach. It can get quite complicated. Marie, I know you were looking at one of our previous shows that featured Parrish Williams and Phil Pruner talking about some of these issues of language and identity. One of the things that Phil brought up was kind of another dilemma, you might say, of the parent of mixed heritage, mixed tribal heritage, or Indian and non-Indian heritage. If it's one tribe plus non-Indian, that's not such a dilemma maybe, but if you have ancestors in 3 or 4 tribes that speak completely different languages, that can become sort of unwieldy in terms of, you know, what are you going to pass on it? And I don't know if you encounter that problem as much out your way, Effie, but certainly in Oklahoma there's so many intertribal marriages that this is something that a lot of people are having to deal with. You know, which language should I teach my children? I know it can be difficult.
Actually, that's kind of an area of interest of mine, and I've had an interview study going on that we're starting on that very topic of when people come from multiple backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, even racial backgrounds. You know, what, as you're saying, what language do they choose? If they choose one language, sometimes that person might feel like they betray their heritage. So it's a very difficult choice. And again, each person will go their way. A couple strategies I was thinking of is, you know, becoming conversational in maybe 1 or 2. If there's one language that feels important for them to learn, there could be a practical issue of, you know, where they live. Maybe there's a language that's important to speak.
Do you think in general, Marie, that it is important to, say you're an Indian person of mixed tribal heritage, do you think it's important to focus on at least one of those cultures and one of those languages? Is there something to be gained psychologically? This is something I've always wanted to ask psychologists. Is it, I kind of have some personal feeling about this, but I'd be interested to see what you have to say professionally. Is it better in some way to be a bicultural person or a bilingual person? Does it somehow make you more healthy or happy or psychologically healthy, you know, in life? Do you have an answer to this?
I'm going to give one of those "it depends" kinds of responses. And it depends if you live, as I think most Indian people these days live, in cities or in places where they're going to interact with many different people, then being bicultural or multicultural helps create maybe a resilience or a protection against the stress of not knowing what to do when you're somewhere, when you're in a school or when you're in a church, or that's stressful to not know what's expected of you. So if you have sort of that more than one cultural identity, that helps to protect you. If you live though in a place, maybe a reservation or a place that emphasizes the traditional way though, I think again, if you're raised more traditionally, then if you look at psychology or the stress of it, then it's maybe not as necessary, not as needed. But again, I hesitate to say it's better to be one way than another, but just that there's always consequences of if you're one or another way. So.
Now, Effie, you have have studied human services and worked in that area already, and you're planning to go for an MA in psychology, right?
Right.
Have you thought of this? I mean, you have your own personal experience as to how happy you've been being sort of a bicultural person, and what each aspect of your life in that way has added to your life. Have you kind of thought, you're probably going to give me one of those it depends answers too, because I know life is like that. But have you kind of thought generally about this question, about what you would advise, for instance, to a young Navajo person who's thinking about which way they want to go in life? As far as, do they want to just jump into the majority culture and try to be successful there and maybe deal with other things later, or would you recommend that they try to maintain that cultural and linguistic thread from an early age? What would you advise people?
Well, my children, they, like I said before, they don't speak or understand Navajo, so I always tell them to, it's a unique thing to do, to learn more than your own language anyway. So I know some people who speaks Hopi Navajo, they're partly Navajo or partly Hopi. So they don't have any problems with learning their own Hopi language and the Navajo language, so it's no problem for them. And I know if a young child tries to make an effort to learn another language or their own language, they can do it.
Yeah. I know a lot of parents, I think, find that they're sort of afraid that the children won't be able to handle two things at once, but as a linguist, in my training, I kind of had that drummed into my head that that's a myth. It's really not true that that's hard for children. In fact, they usually find it rather enriching, and some studies have actually showed that they perform better in English and in the second language if they're raised bilingually. But now let me ask you a little bit more practical question, which is, and this is kind of, I'll be a devil's advocate here, I don't really believe in this question as I'm stating it, but some people might say, isn't all this struggle to save languages and cultures, isn't it kind of just a bit of nostalgia and not so practical? I mean, aren't these things dying out? Don't you prepare young people better for the future by having them, isn't the English and majority culture way the way of the future? Shouldn't we be preparing them more for that? How would you react to that?
I believe in trying to keep your tradition and your native language right along parallel with the Western language. So it's just that much easier to live your life, I suppose, to say.
And as I think you were saying over dinner, you don't necessarily believe that the future is all English speaking.
No,
all majority culture.
It's not dying out, so it'll be around. If if you're at a place where Navajo is spoken, then it will continue in the future to come.
And I think if there's if you come from a background and you hear traditional language from an elder, from a parent, a grandparent, and you don't speak it, I think sometimes there's that feeling of, what am I missing? A feeling of, what have I lost? That you may not even be aware that you think that, but that's one of the areas that we study, is that sense of loss, or that sense of not having that identity question that we started the show with, a sense of who am I related to other people. And, you know, I think language is one of the ways that connects people.
Well, they're showing me that we're almost out of time, believe it or not. But I had one more question. We won't really be able to get into it very much, but maybe you can give us a quick version, Marie. You and I both have a research background. I do in linguistics and you in counseling psychology. And there's often some distrust between researchers, especially non-Indian researchers who have some contact with Indian communities. They're often greeted with a lot of suspicion and so forth. But just, you could probably say this in a sentence, you have an idea of a good solution for that problem, don't you?
Yes, the research needs to come from within, and the questions that Indian people want to ask, that is where research can come from and be useful.
That's where your program, I think, is so useful because it encourages more Native people to become psychologists in this case.
We hope so.
So I think it's great. I want to thank you both again for being on the show. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight, and see you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene